Cool. So the way this is going to work is I'm going to disabuse some pretty common errors which people make when talking about religion.
Dan, can you bring that sheet with you too?
That one?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Cool.
If no one comes to pick it up.
Yeah. So I'm going to disabuse some pretty common errors which people use when they talk about religion, talk about why those things don't work, why they don't make sense. I'm going to talk about the biggest one, the way we should interact with religious stakeholder analysis in debates, because we win debates by stakeholder analysis, but no one does stakeholder analysis correctly on religious people. And then finally, hopefully if we get time, we will analyse some speech which Beavis gave at some small debating tournament at some stage in 2012. Cool. And when I say religion, I'm going to use it in the way the debating community tends to use religion in the Western culture, which is shorthand for kind of Judeo-Christian religious values, that kind of thing. When debating doesn't have a very good perception of religion, there's a lot more nuance to it than that, but generally when we encounter debates set in a religious context in the Western world, it's to do with that kind of belief. You get debates on Islam in the developing world, but very, very rarely, and so I won't do a huge amount. Also, that's far less my area of expertise, so I won't do as much, if any, on those. Okay. A couple of really common errors in religious debates. So firstly, this idea that religion is like regressive or in some way backwards. These terms are often used because debating likes to think of itself as progressive, because debating is a society or kind of like a group of people who call themselves this, kind of like what traditionally sits with the idea of progressiveness. But these words don't actually mean anything, realistically, unless you subscribe to a very particular kind of societal or ethical view. So the idea that like religion is regressive or other things are progressive is very kind of like, oh, is everyone coming back to my session? Oh, guys. So you know, like religion is regressive or like that other things are progressive only works if you subscribe to this particular definition of regressive and progressive, which is very much kind of like secularism, liberal democracy, so on and so forth. And without getting into like, you know, kind of like a really big debate on comparative ethical systems, which by all means you can come up and argue with me after, or Jake, I'll hammer it to Jake. Without talking about like, you know, how we compare ethical systems and that kind of thing, there's no real basis for saying that religion is regressive unless you subscribe to a very particular set of ethical standards, in which case you're just saying, by this particular set of ethical standards, which debating just kind of accepts, religion is regressive. Okay, number two, religious people are bigoted. There's varying degrees to which this kind of analysis crops up in its extremity. We're generally pretty good at not characterising all religious people as the Westboro Baptist Church. They're not. Like, for clarification, there are normal religious people out there. But, like, don't fall into the trap in debates of saying that all religious people are, you know, fanatics, or all religious people are, you know, like uncompromising. To some extent, that, like, you know, that might be true, but in the way it's characterised, it's often done wrongly. It's often done in a very negative sense. Yeah, Keith.
Going back to the religious regressive.
Yeah.
Once we had an argument which was made saying that yes, religions do get to involve in society, but like their evolution is like 100 years outdated. Like when the Catholic Church is accepting of gay people now is way past when society decided to accept it. How do you feel about that?
Yep, cool. So in case this thing is recording stuff, the question is, if we look at the church as being evolutionary over a longer scale of time, so for instance the Catholic Church now accepting gay people as opposed to society which did about 20 years ago, not even that, how do we rebut that argument that the church is becoming progressive in that sense? So the question you've got to ask yourself is, and this will make probably a lot of you double take, and it's like, you know, it's an argument which I can't fully flesh out now, but you've got to ask yourself, why is it necessarily, and I'm going to get to this later, why is it necessarily a good thing for the church to accept gay people? Why is it necessarily a good thing for the church to ordain women, and so on and so forth? And it sounds a bit counterintuitive because we're all used to the idea that, you know, like, we must all subscribe to this particular kind of egalitarian equality. But that egalitarian equality doesn't exist within a religious matrix, right? And so within that sense, it doesn't make any sense for religions to become more progressive in that sense. Does that answer your question?
The problem is why, when they say why is it necessary for religions to accept gay people and women and give them equal status, it's the argument about discrimination.
Pardon?
The argument about why religion should accept women and gay people. The argument is it's about equality and like not having discrimination. And when the church has that much influence on society, discriminating them then has to be.
Yep. Okay, I'm going to answer that later. So shut up. All right. So religion is regressive, religious people are bigoted. Not true. The second one is probably more true than the first. There is an astonishing number of people who do use religion as a way to be bigoted in all sorts of forms. So from the extreme, like, right-wing American Christians to people who, like, happen to have very strong views and base them on religion. It's probably not legitimate, but that's not really an argument we need to have here. Cool. First two. All right, the big problem, and this is going to answer your question, Keith. So, how does normal stakeholder analysis work? On the floor.
You figure out what the stakeholder cares about. You then figure out what incentives are acting on it that interact with those things, and then you say he will never act this way, and that will be good or bad.
Yeah, absolutely. Jake's exactly right. So we want to know what the stakeholders care about, what's good for them due to that care, how they're going to react to certain policies, right? So we've got to then ask the question, what does this mean for religious debates? Because we have a tendency to approach religious stakeholders in exactly the same way as we approach other stakeholders. So we get to my point in bold. Secular ethics are not, by definition, are not desirable things for religious organizations, right? So, for instance, let me give you the classic example, which we did a debate on however long, a couple of weeks ago at Sorensen. The religious organization should be forced to ordain women, gay people, etc., etc. If, let's take some stakeholder analysis. If you get these people here who believe that every day is being read out to them, the holy authored word of God, and that the person who is expounding that is literally God's messenger to those people, then to put someone who they think is a heretic in that place delegitimizes their entire religion, right, and forces a very visceral reaction. So that's kind of the example you're talking about. You've got to address people. So in the same way that, like, when we analyze any other stakeholder, we do it by entering into their calculational matrix and trying to analyze what they want. We should do the same thing for religion. So we should argue that things are good, not because they make religious organizations more egalitarian or anything like that. We should argue that things are good for religion because they make religion more true to itself, or because they fulfill those people's religions better. Does that make sense?
But surely need to do both, right? So if obviously it's an active debate about the Catholic Church should do something, then that makes sense. But if it's a debate about we should force an institution, like the government should force an institution to do something, isn't also part of the debate whose ethics we should follow?
Yeah, and that's absolutely true. And so, insofar as I can only make this session so broad, I just want to talk about particularly how we look at religious stakeholders. But yeah, that's right. And sorry, just 2 seconds. And this obviously won't be the only question in a debate about religion. There will be other ones. And like Rowan's right, sometimes you do have to engage in an ethical balance system. But you should be aware that you do that. A lot of the time, debates and debaters just kind of accept that there is X, which is kind of this secularistic, individualistic, somewhat subjectivist, but not entirely kind of ethical framework. Yeah, yes, Mira and Asher, your questions, Asher?
So often in debates where I feel like it goes down that tangent, someone will bring up the point that religions do change over time, and that they have changed and they have conformed to modern standards. Obviously all religions aren't harsh, so how does that conflict? How's that resolved?
Hang on, I don't see the conflict.
So saying that religions want to be as true to themselves as possible,
Yep.
then someone else can say, yes, but religious people have actually benefited from taking on secular values or more modernist values into their religions.
Well, that depends largely on your conception of benefit, right? You're assuming that a benefit is to adhere, there seems to be implicit in that the assumption that a benefit is to become more secularist, not that that is the correct word to use, but in terms of the way we view things in an ethical sense. And that's not necessarily true, right? So it's perfectly possible for the same consequence to occur, but be motivated by two completely different things and be good for two completely different reasons, right? Samir, did you have something?
In terms of you talking about we can't characterize all of religions as bigoted.
Yep.
In terms of talking about religions' responses to government actions that impinge upon their freedom, how do we still turn that into a visceral one? If we say that religions aren't progressive and they're not completely bigoted, a lot of the argumentation based on religious responses to actions is that these organizations will do their insane, batshit crazy stuff.
Sure.
If we don't go down that route, what other harm could we say religion is doing to society in response?
So hang on, are you trying to say that as you're trying to say that religion is doing a harm to society, therefore the government should step in, or the government?
Government does something to religion.
Yep. And then
Religion's like, oh no, we don't like that. We'll respond. If we don't characterize them as regressive and bigoted, which is the easiest thing to do, how do we still turn that response into something that has larger weight?
Okay, so I think you could do a couple of things. You obviously, sorry, is this a response to that question? Yeah.
With regard to that, isn't it more of a matter of marginal analysis? So rather than conflating everyone who is religious into a single group,
Yeah, absolutely. So like that's one way of going about it. You could go that there are extreme margins, the same way there are extreme margins in any human group. You could try and maximise that harm. So go like, sure, the mainstream will be fine, but the Westboro Baptist Church will kick up a stink. The other way you could do it is to say that, the general reaction of normal people to that harm will still be bad, right? Like, you will create religious protests. Like, religious people are allowed to protest. That doesn't make them crazy, that kind of thing. So you can maximise that and going, like, by the fact that that is so widespread or something. Does that kind of give you something to go on? Cool. Okay. So the final point, the point of religion's often treated, that bullet point is poorly worded, I apologise. It's true, but it's poorly worded for this purpose. So religion is often treated, in terms of like the way we analyse it, as kind of like an interest club, right? Just a particularly abusive interest club. So like, it's treated like, your bowls club or your, whatever, your board gaming club or your debating club. Like people want to do certain things, so they go to that meeting and they enjoy that sense of community. And what we'll get to in a second is that by its very nature, any religion has to mean a whole lot more than that. You can't simply characterise it legitimately as something which people go to because they have some kind of vague common interest or they want to be included. Okay, so let's take your classic example. Your gay female ordination, that kind of thing. This is the one which possibly comes up the most. So you get your affirmative argument, good because it does hashtag standard debating analysis. Like, on a side note, I really wish there was a point you could get to in debates at which you could go to the adjudicator, please insert your normal debating analysis here, because it would save so much time and make everything so much easier. But so there's your standard affirmative argument, right? Okay, so that might all be true. It might promote the equality of women and that kind of thing. It might promote the equality of gay people. It might cut against prejudice. But it assumes that the ethical agenda of these organisations, which for the purposes of argument we generally have to take as comparatively legitimate. Like I said at the start, this is all assuming that we kind of buy into a legitimacy of concurrent ethical systems. But that, unfortunately, is a debate which is too big to kind of shoehorn into any debate, really. It's generally accepted, though, in debating that different ethical systems are legitimate. We don't criticise people for being deontologists or for being utilitarians. And so, okay, yes, to some extent, and we are implicitly utilitarian basically everything. We generally accept like the legitimacy of concurrent ethical systems, and that there doesn't seem to be a hugely concrete reason why that should not extend to the non-crazy variety of religion. Okay, so this might all be true, but it assumes that the ethical agenda of these organisations is identical to our standard debating one. So let's assume a reasonable assumption here. For religion, your ultimate ethical goal is to fulfil your God-given purpose, to be godly, right? Whatever sense that means, for whether that's, like for a Christian or a Muslim or a Jew, etc., etc. Is there more ethically better for an adherent of that religion to be unequal if it means they're fulfilling that role, right? And you can actually construct this argument in a secular sense. So if you, ethically say value self-actualization or self-fulfillment, you can construct it under that same matrix because it fulfills that person, it actualizes that person better to be what might be perceived as oppressed or repressed because it actualizes them better. So let me give you an example. Classic one from Christianity, which everyone loves picking on. Wives submit to your husbands. Christianity is inherently patriarchal and evil. So in this context, feminism, as we use it, means somewhere between jack and shit. Feminism in the Christian context would mean being a more godlike woman, being a woman who is truer to what God wants you to do and wants you to be. And so in that sense, it's probably actually, if you assume that verse is true, which not all Christians do, but in that sense, it's more feminist for a Christian woman to be submissive because that is more fulfilling of her God-given role, right? And you can, and like I just said before, you can spin that both ways. You can do that from a secular perspective as well, if entering into those shoes is too repellent for you. Does that make sense? Yeah, Keith?
Most religious debates are about proving social utility versus religious rights. So if your side has to prove that religious rights is so sacrosanct, then you have to uphold it above social utility. How do you go about doing that?
Why is it above social utility?
Okay, so what happens is with the other example that we had about sex ed, for example, or even the ordination of this thing. So one side would always try and prove that essentially religious schools teaching sex ed or having a gay female ordination is good for society and utility in society. So obviously on the other side you argue what is better is actually upholding.
Yeah, and so it runs into a problem insofar as I'm trying to kind of universalize analysis, which is always problematic. It runs into a particular problem when you get to that kind of religious schools, religious sex ed argument, because you're dealing with children, and children, you don't have a set course for their life in the same sense you do in adults. Adults tend not to change very much. You can assume that a religious adult will probably remain a religious adult. So the number of stakeholders who are harmed by perhaps drifting away is minimal, whereas with kids it's very different. So, all right, so how do we approach that? Yeah, go, Jake.
So, one thing you can do is, if you want to stick within the utilitarian context, what you could say is that having rights actually is a good way of maximising utility. So, if I give these people, religion is so important to these people that they can't tell back no wisdom. So this allows you, when you're balancing social utility against having rights, you just say, well, actually, rights are the best way of getting social utility. The other thing you can do is to try and say that these religious rights are really important in and of themselves because rights actually exist and they actually matter, like really, instead of saying, well, religious sort of social conscience. So if you can argue that rights exist, which a lot of people probably believe in some extent, then you can use that and then you sort of win pretty quickly because rights sort of trump everything.
So in this example, how do you essentially get to it? When you're supposed to say that religious rights is so important that marginalization of like homosexuals and females is okay, even though it brings no social utility by upholding them.
But it does. It does for those religious people.
Well, yeah, that. So, like, firstly, number one, it does bring social utility to religious people. That depends on where you're setting it, obviously, because in Australia, utility for religious people is obviously much less a benefit than will be in, say, America. But, hold on 2 seconds. But number two, you're still utilitarian, right? You're still going, rights are only good insofar as they provide utility. And what Jake's point was is like, no, you can affirm a deontological perspective and just go, no, rights are absolute. That's it. If you have a right to do something, you have the right to do that thing, regardless of what harm might result from it. Sorry, Samir first.
The other way you can look at that is just from like a marginal utility for these people. Like, sure, we ordain a gay priest. Well, that's wonderful, but you know how good that does to society is incomparable to the amount of harm it does to that religion and members of that religion. I think that's also like an easier way than going through the rights analysis.
Yeah. Amy?
Well, there's also like an argument, especially when you're talking about females and gay people being ordained. You should grow up in a community that deliberately marginalizes those people, those specific like gender or sexuality. That's harmful for you growing up because you're growing up in a society with a belief that you are lesser than, say, a heterosexual man than like if you are a woman or if you are gay. And that's harmful because when you grow up thinking that, you inherently believe that you are conditioned to believe that, you internalize those ideas, useful patterns.
This is my point from before, right, is that you're still couching your idea in the language of liberal democratic secularism, right? But like my point from before is like, for that society goes...
How do you run from that harm towards those people who are being marginalized, and who are being told from a young age that they are not worthy? Like, because they're not consenting to that religion, right? If you're a child, you're growing up with that religious ideology.
Yeah.
You haven't consented, you haven't made a full decision to say, this is what atheism looks like, this is what Hinduism looks like, oh, this is Christianity. Well, I like Christianity best. You're not making a full decision.
We've got it. That's, I think, the thing that is actually true. But remember, whenever you've got to, in any sort of debate where you've got prioritising religious actors against prioritising the liberal democratic viewpoint, which is normally that clash, right? You've got to then prioritise, especially in that context where there are lots more religious people than a relatively small factor that is harmed. And so you then do that firstly by saying that you don't actually get that benefit that you're claiming, right? Especially if those religious people really strongly hold that belief. They're not going to stop holding that belief. But that's utility, right? But secondly, you then go, but hang on, if religious people have, like there is other utility that is harmed, rights are a very good proxy for utility, and we care about, but also religion has other inherent benefits, and we can't actually evaluate, like an external activity very quickly evaluating.
But this is the clash. The clash is about utility versus rights. And the point is that these religious rights like matter. I don't care about you say harm. So like I care about harms, right? In the debate we were talking about, where you talk about religious actors, you said, well, yeah, there are these harms and they're bad and I don't like them, but rights trump them because they're rights. And rights are they
Absolute in violation.
This is like where the clash lies, or at least where the debate actually happens.
Yep.
I'm a bit lost on the side discussion on that talking. Can you just briefly summarize?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So what Jay kind of summarised and what that's been talking about just then is you've got, broadly speaking, these two kinds of schools of ethical thought. There are other ones, but broadly speaking, two which are generally accepted and generally used in debates. You've got, on the one hand, a kind of utilitarian calculus. So what matters is utility. Utility just meaning goodness under whatever kind of definition you assign to that. So, you know, like if we can maximize over all people utility, that's good. So, you know, what's a good, like, you know, we should give free hot dogs to everyone because hot dogs are tasty and people like tasty things, and that maximizes the utility of everyone. Does that make sense? Yeah.
So when they're just discussing the basics with the principle of debating and religion, or they're speaking specifically in some problems in religion?
They're talking about this clash between, so that first one, utilitarianism, and the second one, which is rights-based theory, so that we have rights, and those rights are just completely inviolate. You just have that right by virtue of being a right, and the rights are just like unable to be crossed. You can't abuse those because they're just things we have by virtue of being human, and you can exercise those rights regardless of what harm arises from it. Does that make sense? Cool. And in a lot of debates, you have to balance those two things. Yeah.
So where do you argue the rights come from? Like, you say from your God, or?
It depends on the debate. It depends on the right you're arguing as well. Because there's a threshold in debating, like not in philosophy, but in debating there's a threshold down to which you go. Like certain rights, debaters are generally happy to let you say just exist because they exist. Right? You could talk to Jay afterwards about how we determine rights and where they come from, but we should crack on. So, yeah, like in a philosophical sense, rights are a very difficult thing to determine. In a debating sense, you can get down to things like, you know, right to life, right to freedom, things which are a really big question. Okay. All right, so the solution. I've kind of touched on these already. We've got to adopt a different imperative. We've got to not ask what makes these people more egalitarian, what makes these people more true to their religion. That's what they want. It's better for them. It's better for them and their worldview. That makes a better analysis, right? It kind of hits both things. It's steps into their shoes, but it also works from, like I mentioned earlier, from a more secular perspective. All right. So the logical, hold on, Kim. So the logical challenge to this, and the only real way, arguably, to ask some of these topics is just go religion is a lie. It's bullshit. So, fight me. Fight me. If I was AF, it would be completely legitimate. Depends on the debate. Like sometimes you can get away without it, but a lot of the time, and also it's never explicit because if you make it explicit, that just drags the debate to hell. Ironically, it just drags the debate straight down. But often it's easier to AF just on the implicit basis that religion is bullshit. So you can use the opt-in argument, like Amy pointed out before. It doesn't necessarily work for children, but you can kind of come back to that with the fact that, you know, that's true of all children everywhere. Like, you know, that's a universal thing. That's not a problem with religion. That's just a problem with, like, the fact that parenting as an institution exists. So that carries a certain amount of weight, but you can really minimize it by the fact that going, like, well, you know, certain parents get to raise their children certain ways and so on and so forth. Yeah.
Is there anything more to religion? Would that just, like, shift the next debate to, like, what is the point of Christianity or any other religion? Like, is the point to follow the words written down 2,000 years, or is it to follow the general principles of being a good person? Like, we're saying that, oh, this makes people more true religion. Like, hey, need like knowledge of that religion, people become contentious. But just, like, again, drag that debate down into, like, what is the point of religion?
Yes and no. So yes, if you don't know anything about what the points of various religions are, which is why you should learn. So for instance, you mentioned the point of Christianity is to be a good person. That's not true. So if you can set up as an imperative what the points of certain religions are, like that kind of thing. So if we're arguing in a Christian context, you know, like you can set up like, you know, okay, so the Christian wants to abide by these certain things. It doesn't actually take a huge amount of effort to know those certain things. Like you could probably like find some quick summary. I wouldn't go online. That would probably be slightly biased. You could probably find some quick summary somewhere. If you can present that, that makes your argument a whole lot more powerful, right? If you can go like, well, we know what the point of this religion is, and this is why it makes you better at that. Okay. Cool. That's that bit done. How is time? Yeah, not too bad. Okay, case study. Beavis' speech at some shitty thingy somewhere. Let's hope this works. All right, so let's have a watch of this. This is still the best speech dealing with religion I've seen. And afterwards we'll discuss what's good or bad. So is the audio going to work? Plus work. Work plus. Because the YouTube one is abysmal. The audio just does not work. No, there isn't. The audio is unintelligible. Yep. This is going well. Classic gags. Is my internet working? What? Ah, my internet is not working. That's a very poor time for that to happen. Ah, excellent. Good. Okay. All right, cool. Let's have a listen.
The extension of the post-opposition would be that purity of doctrine is absolutely necessary for any religious community, more than just a religion, a community that prioritizes its integrity and its work of that religion. Its doctrine is essential for the benefits and interests of the community. Young Garrison supported. What is the duty of a religion to anybody, to the state, to anyone who's likely to harm? That was the essential post-opposition. Religion provides an environment of salvation or one of damnation. The first one. It can cut you off from outside factors. You're not entitled to salvation off the bat. You're not entitled to just say that because you want to label yourself something, you get the benefits of that thing without conforming to it. And second, let's just take a step back. The conception of damnation and of hell is something that's been retreated from all forms of religion for the majority of the world. Let's have a realistic conception of what most religions and religious communities are like. We think it's legitimate for a community to decide if you would like to be a part of us. You will cut yourself off from outside education. You will ascribe to the values that we say. Because we have to give you eternal life. We have to give you the validity of spirituality. That's effectively what we have. But then we're taught the second and fourth benefits to freedom of religion. Anti-discrimination law, use of tongues, differentiated school standards, and the theory.
If he does as high up as it can go. Is this volume? I don't want to press that in case it pops up.
Good to go.
Oh, yeah. I found the volume control. Do people want me to go back? Could people hear any of that? All good? Cool.
Secondly, we think that the divine must be absolute. The divine must be something that is not crowdsourced, right? It has to be a thing that is above and beyond this kind of thing that a person can uniquely and directly question. We think spiritual leaders have the ability to lead their flock in a different way, to engage in the kind of progressivism that they want. We think that individuals don't have the ability to value and validate another's conception of what religion means to them. So to the extent you are portraying someone else's doctrine, it's probably true that you are better off outside that doctrinal system. We think that if it is true that there is ostracism, and if it is true that these people do not like the threat of heretics, it means to make that stigma and that pain felt much more early, so you stifle the dissenting voice at the earliest possible opportunity. And let's go with this, because what we would like to bring you as well is that you need control to allow communities to feel secure in their questioning and allow them to feel secure in their liberalisation. Because we're happy to stand for religious to be absolutes. But should they feel like they liberalise, or should they feel like they wish to question their doctrine, wish to question their nuance, we think it's important that they know that should the conversation turn down an alley that is anathema to them, they can stop that they feel that they have control over the narrative of their doctrine. When they say, you can do this, but you cannot do that, let's explore the intricacies of what is permissible under our faith. That is when you get the best kind of stuff. When people feel like they're in control, and when people feel like they don't have to be at the behest of the state, you have stability and exclusion. Fifthly, it allows for clear construction of people's identities within that community. Why? Because the community dominates. Because when the community has the ability to exclude, they probably have the incentive to say, these are the kind of things that we will get you kicked out. These are the kind of things that we believe are absolutely important. And let's understand that there can be very blurred boundaries under the status quo which they don't have the ability to do that. So like, what elements of the Hadith in Islam are considered binding? What elements of progressivism within Judaism are considered legitimate and what are not? So we think once you have that delineation, once you have that saying, we have the ability to erect Buddhist structures. These are the rules and tenets of our faith. That gives individuals a much better ability to decide on the divine, on like the divine smorgasbord again, where that religion actually means to them. Whether that's a faith that has been clarified, and in that clarification is something that is attractive to them. We think that leads to a much better construction of your identity. When you're more able to see what faith means to you, when you're more able to see what faith means to itself, and whether that actually represents your conception of what the divine should be. We think in light of that, it's absolutely essential that religions have the ability to purify their doctrine in a communal sense. They retain control, because it leads very much to the benefits they kind of wanted. Because the control being questioned, the ability to feel like they can have dissent, but moderated dissent. One in which they maintain the control of the process, the control of the divine. That's what we want to bring you in opposition.
Cool. All right. So, there you go. Best speech Beavis has ever given. Pity he gave it at such an unimportant tournament. All right. So, what do you guys think, given what I've talked to you about so far, what do you guys think that speech did well?
Classification of religious person.
Yep. And what do you mean by that?
As in exactly what you were talking about at the start, as a religious person is not someone that is looking necessarily good in the world or thing, it's looking to pursue their own sort of belief in the word of God type.
Good, exactly. I think it's as close to a legitimate characterization of religious people as you'll get in debating. This idea that, people pick religion because it's what they want. Like, at the end of the day, you could argue that is possibly true. Anyone else? What else did the speech do well? No one? Keith, you were really excited for this session. What else was good in that speech? Yeah. This shit.
Just the stability of faith and how it's important to not sometimes maybe like refinements towards something more liberal could be destructive in the long run because you see that it's compromising that it kind of destroys your life.
Good. Yeah. So this is kind of a problem with the speech, which I'll get to in a second. But yeah, that idea that, to a religious person or to a religion, it is essentially important that, if you're talking about the holy authored word of God, that stays pure and that does not abjure it, right? That is not compromised. Doubly so, that's not compromised by some kind of evil secular government, because the government is evil. Okay. All right, a couple of things about this speech which I think are really important. So number one, it accurately portrays the nature of how religion works. Very few people actually bother engaging with this in debates. There's just kind of this conception like, religion is a thing which you just get indoctrinated into and that's why you believe. So, like almost all religions, with the exception of Buddhism and perhaps kind of Hinduism, are about like, you know, salvation, like salvation is a very Christian word to use. About, how do you frame this? About like, you know, being rewarded for your life in a sense, almost.
It's usually a virtue thing. Like certainly for Christianity and Islam, it's like being godly or something.
Yeah, like, but the end goal of that is to obtain some kind of like good life afterwards. Like that seems to be the goal of most religions, again with the exception of Buddhism, kind of with the exception of Hinduism. So, to a religious person, right, as Beavis pointed out, that value is huge, right? Like, you know, like who cares about money if, like, you know, it's a choice between like money and like literally living forever in paradise, right? And the other point which is important, it's not something you get simply by labeling yourself, right? This is why the characterization of religions as interest groups is illegitimate, because the benefits of religion, quote unquote, as far as they exist, aren't provided simply because you call yourself a Christian or because you call yourself a Muslim or because you call yourself a Jew. They're provided because you are godly and because you live a godly life and that kind of thing. The benefits of religion don't come just because you say you are a member of that religion. They come from adhering to that religion actively. Okay, so that's number one. It portrays how it works. Number two, realizes to a large extent the importance of religion. I kind of already touched on that. Oh, door's locked. Okay. And number three, finally, it points out really the problem with attempting to, or at least the perceptual problem with censoring the scriptures, with changing the scriptures actively, you know, the government changing the scriptures. Because, like, you know, like this is divinity we're talking about. Divinity can't be crowdsourced. The word of God can't be dictated by popular government. That's just ridiculous, right? Like purely notionally, that idea does not hold up. Okay, couple of drawbacks, and then we're basically done, and it'll be pizza time. All right. So a couple of bad things. It's really important about what you talked about before. Arguably, I think to my mind, it still doesn't quite go far enough. I mean, obviously, I have a slight degree of bias here. So, like, I am perhaps, you know, like going for distant pastures and that kind of thing. This might be as good as we're able to get in a debating context. But arguably, it doesn't really go far enough because if you really look at the speech, if you deconstruct it, as I think, like, you know, those of you with more of a bent towards philosophy will have noticed, it still assumes this idea of, like, you know, religion as a means of actualization, religion as a means of kind of like...
Alex, should this be passed around?
I believe so. I don't really know. So, it still seems to rest on this idea of, like, you know, religion as self-actualization or self-fulfillment, which is problematic, right? Particularly, like, in the second half speech when he, like, you know, Beavis talks about, you know, why it's important for religious people to control their narrative and that kind of thing. It's very much returning that debatory idea that, you know, like, it's all about individual autonomy and, like, you know, you should control your own narrative and that kind of thing. So, you know, I get it.
Responsive though within the context of that.
Yeah, absolutely, and like it's necessary within that debate, and that's why I think it might be as good as we're going to get in terms of a debating context. And like, bear in mind that this is not for me to say that you shouldn't use any of these arguments. I'm simultaneously trying to improve you as debaters and make you better people. But like, you know, like the former is often like a consequence of the latter, right? If you actually understand how religion works a bit better, you're more likely to produce good debating arguments about it. And perhaps it's impossible to really overcome this in a debate without making the debate purely about whether religion is legitimate or not, which is not the point of any debate. So, good for, like I said, my final dot point, it's good for existing to kind of understand that, like, you know, religion is not just some kind of like thing about self-actualization or that kind of thing. Cool.
Isn't with religion, it almost, it's probably the most important, like the most specific topic you're going to talk about where people's goals aren't individual often, and it depends for which religion. Maybe, I don't know that much about Christianity, but I'd say a lot of other religions has a very collective goal in mind and a very collective interest.
So what do you mean by that? Are we talking... Sorry, I'm confused about your question. Can you clarify it slightly, please?
So you're talking about, like, for example, like the pursuit of a pan-Islamic state by, you know, Islamist extremist groups, or are you talking about like Christians genuinely trying to follow the goal of becoming, you know, like I don't know.
All my point was that if ever in a debate you're going to talk about if someone's goal is not an individual religion, it's probably the most appropriate topic where it's going to come up. The heaviest.
Yeah, sure. So,
for example, like philosophy Judaism, it's the goal isn't a sort of self-redemption, but it's a bringing of the Messiah.
It's
heal the world, and it's through your prayer that's going to happen.
Yeah, that's true. So what's so like? Yeah, I agree. What's the point? What's the question? Okay. Yeah. So like, I mean, that's certainly true. Like, I mean, insofar as arguably, insofar as any community will also have community-oriented goals, like there are both. And it's not entirely the point of Judaism, but it is certainly a valid point of Judaism. Cool. All right, so that winds up the session. Has anyone had any questions? Yeah, Jake.
This is possibly just the wrong time in which possibly should have been silent. You said something like, what you need to do is characterize religion in a reasonable way.
Yeah.
And you said that you know a bunch of stuff about Christianity, and apparently you do. Can you quickly do some sort of like picture of like some important differences in the world, like how Christians see the world, something like this, so that we can use it?
In particular with the aims that we're talking about, if it isn't about self-fulfillment or if it isn't like a global perspective, then if it's like, can you just tell us what it's about? More individual or social perspective?
Sure, absolutely. So broadly the question is, why do people believe and what does that belief look like? Is that an accurate paraphrase? Yeah, cool. So number one, why do people believe? Probably two reasons. I like to think there's only one reason, but really there's two reasons. Two reasons why people believe. Number one is because it's what they're accustomed to. This is a universal thing. This is not just with belief. Like, people do all sorts of things just because they're accustomed to them. That's where you will end up getting the more problematic elements of religion, I think. People who just do things because they think vaguely that's what they ought to do, or because that's what they've been told they ought to do. Number two, people believe because they actually think it's true. Because, people have actually, thought about, compared and that kind of thing. And, decide, okay, well, I think that this thing is true. This is sadly less likely and less probable. So, but
What are the beliefs? I think that's the like for these Christians that you know about.
yeah,
What are these beliefs? Like, we now know why they might believe. What do they?
yeah. I was asking Chicago's questions. Sit down. Gosh, Jake. Yeah. So like, as to why people believe, those are broadly, I think, the two reasons. Sadly, the second is less common than it ought to be, but I still think it's common enough that you can run good arguments under it. Okay, so what does it look like? Obviously, I'm going to give you an example of Christianity. I could talk to some degree about what it means in Hinduism or Buddhism, Judaism, but it's not my expertise, so I'll be more likely to say things which are wrong. So notable differences for the Christian worldview. See, I feel like I should know these better. I'm trying to think. I'm trying to think of good examples. Well, I don't like the word conversion because it carries such terrible connotations. But so things like, shit.
So one big aim is to glorify God.
Okay, all right, sure. So you're talking about calculational decisions, right? So the calculational decision of the Christian is the fundamental motive of everything which Christians do. And remember, I'm talking in an ideal sense here. There are also Christian reasons why people won't act like this, but that gets very complicated and leads into theological discussions about sin. So why do Christians do stuff? Christians do stuff because, at the end of the day, the goal is to become more like Christ, right? That is literally the name of the religion. And so you do things to that end, right? To that end, and bearing in mind that point is not to make you a good person. It's commonly conceived of that Christianity is kind of a moral guidance system, and that's not true because of the Christian conception of salvation. So the Christian does things to become a more godly person, but also they believe that certain things are right and wrong because they are sinful or not sinful, right? And so sinful or not sinful carries a greater connotation of right and wrong than you would use in the ordinary secular sphere, right? Because the secular sphere can't possibly have anything like the weight of divine wrath or divine approval. And so, for instance, if we're talking about gay sex is the classic example, or women in positions of authority or whatever. If if that is considered to be sinful, then it's a significantly greater barrier in terms of enacting that than just being sexist or misogynist is, because suddenly if you do want to perceive it as sexism or misogyny, it's got divine authority right behind it. So number one, we got this idea that the calculational matrix is fundamentally kind of glorify God to become more Christ-like. Number two, this idea that rights and wrongs and things which are good or bad are much more heavy, much more potent in the context of religion than in the context of non-religion. Right? And there are a bunch of little intricacies, but I don't think I can give you much more than that because from there it becomes quite interpretative. Any other questions before we wrap up?